we're seeing higher intensity events more often. We're likelier seeing more severe weather as we move into the future.
We're actually starting to see some of the increased incidents of high-end storm events like the Derechos that went through Iowa and caused so much agricultural damage.
When we start seeing these bigger surges of rain, we know this stuff is changing. I don't care what you call it, I'm going to adapt to it, and that's how we're going to keep farming.
There's a high likelihood that our flooding events are going to become more intense and more often.
2008 made it through the flood, 2016 came back again. The Derecho, we can't afford to lose everything again.
And not have this happen again and expect a similar type of recovery.
Iowa's wild weather is becoming more extreme. Floods, drought, derechos, tornadoes.
What should be once-in-a-lifetime events are happening more frequently.
And these billion-dollar disasters are costing you more than just money.
In our half-hour special tonight, the Iowa's News Now Weatherfirst team tracks how you're coping with the extreme weather and what's being done to protect your community.
In order to understand these extreme weather systems, we wanted to look into why the weather is changing, how we know it's changing, and how we know it's getting worse. But first, we have to talk about the C word, Nathan.
Yeah, well, we do. I spoke with an atmospheric scientist and expert in climate modeling to better understand what scientists mean when we say that the climate is changing.
The sun, which we know and love, it emits energy. That light falls on the planet, heats up the surface of the Earth. The surface of the Earth then emits light in what we call infrared spectrum, which you can kind of feel but not see. As we emit more of these greenhouse gases and as we get more CO2 and methane in the atmosphere, that balance is tipped a little bit, and more of that infrared radiation is being reflected back down to the planet and heating it up. There is this observatory on a mountain peak in Hawaii, the Mauna Loa Climate Observatory, where some of the cleanest air on the planet is. And so this is what we call the Keeling curve. It's that curve of the parts per million of CO2 molecules per other molecules of air. And the problem with anthropogenic climate change is the rate at which it happens. It's happening in decadal rather than centuries or millennia. We're actually seeing some of the earlier simulations that we made of the climate being verified. We're actually starting to see some of the increased incidents of high-end storm events like the Derecho that went through Iowa and caused so much agricultural damage actually coming into being.
The derecho is just one example of those very extreme wild weather events that have occurred in the last several decades in eastern Iowa. I speak with a state climatologist about how these extreme events are linked to climate change.
2008 made it through the flood.
Barb Hartgrave owns County Line Catering and Barbecue.
2016 came back again.
She's been running restaurants in Cedar Rapids for nearly 20 years.
We've just been trying to keep going with it, and then the Derecho.
During that time, she's been impacted by multiple historical weather events.
We have to be cautious in terms of looking at individual events and saying, oh, this is climate change induced. If we start to see behavior moving forward in terms of tornadic behavior, for example, then we can start to say that yes, the fingerprints of climate change are on tornado outbreaks.
What Barb has been through can be explained by climate change. Temperatures have been increasing across the globe.
Now you look at the last 30 years, we've actually doubled that temperature increase per decade.
And that affects weather over time.
Warmer atmospheres hold more water vapor, and that has implications on severe weather, flooding.
In 2008, the first disaster struck Cedar Rapids and 3 of Barb's restaurants.
I think it all happened in that same day, but the water filled the basement, which was 12 feet, and then it filled our restaurants with about 5.5 feet of water. So anything that was in there was not salvageable.
During that time, not many people near the Cedar River had flood insurance because the river had never gone over 20 feet in the 157 years on record. That day, the river rose over 31 feet.
We're seeing more 50, 100-year floods that we haven't seen going back several decades.
Barb was able to get enough money to reopen one restaurant downtown, and then 8 years later, the Cedar threatened again.
We were forced to shut down for 2 weeks, move all of our stuff to higher ground.
The river didn't rise as high as expected, but still got over that 20-foot threshold for only the second time ever.
So there's a high likelihood that our flooding events are going to become more intense and more often as we move through the 21st century.
Unfortunately, because Barb didn't have damage in 2016, she once again did not have insurance coverage. She decided to keep going though and opened up her catering business away from the river.
I'm not a quitter. I won't quit. And I hate failure.
In addition to catering, Barb serves people out of her barbecue barn. She was doing just that on August 10th, 2020. She was packing up as she watched the dark clouds ahead of the derecho roll in when winds trapped her and her manager inside.
And we got underneath the table, and it wasn't 2 minutes after that, and the whole thing went over. Finally, after 45 minutes, it started clearing up enough, and I heard my son's truck coming up, and I heard him screaming, "I don't want to look, I don't want to look." Sorry.
No, it's terrifying.
It was.
99.9th percentile event. I don't think we should see one of those in the next, that's a generational storm, hopefully. But if we look at the climatology of derechos, we experience one in Iowa every 2 years. Now we've had 2 in 2 years. The first December derecho in United States history, let alone the largest tornado outbreak for the state of Iowa, and we can expect those extremes moving forward.
State climatologist Justin Glisson briefly mentioned that unprecedented tornado outbreak, and that's just one piece of the puzzle.
Yeah, we have seen some significant changes in our tornado numbers in just the last few years. In Iowa alone, since 1950, 8 of the top 10 largest tornado outbreaks on record have occurred since the year 2000. 2 of the top 4 tornado outbreaks happened just last year. We are seeing more tornadoes, but the timing is becoming more unusual as well. May and June historically are the most active tornado months in Iowa. However, the top tornado outbreaks in Iowa history are now shifting to more unusual months. The top 2 are in December and August. The overall trend is larger tornado outbreaks overall.
Now, since the 1950s, if we look at days in which we have at least one tornado forming, we're actually seeing that trend go down. Where the trend is increasing are days in which we see 30 tornadoes or more.
The tornado season in 2022 already off to a fast start, including the deadly EF4 tornado affecting Winterset. That tornado tracked more than 70 miles, the 7th longest track in state history.
Right after the break, I'll take you to an Iowa town nearly wiped off the map due to flooding.
And I'll show you how Iowa's changing climate is impacting how farmers work to feed your family and how new techniques can help prevent major flooding. That's in my special report straight ahead.